There is a moment in some relationships that looks sudden from the outside but has been building silently for a very long time. One day, the messages stop. The calls go unanswered, the warmth disappears. No explanation, no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye. Just distance, final and unmistakable. People who experience this from the other side often describe it as shocking, cruel, or cold. They call it abandonment, ghosting, emotional erasure. But for the person who cut ties without warning, it was not sudden at all. The psychology of people who cut ties without warning, often referred to as the INFJ Door Slam, though it extends far beyond any single personality label, is rooted in endurance, not impulsivity. It is not the behavior of someone who gives up easily. It is the behavior of someone who stayed far too long. To understand this pattern, you have to understand that these individuals do not detach quickly, they attach deeply. They observe carefully, they tolerate silently. And they give multiple chances, often more than is healthy, before they ever consider leaving. What looks like a sudden cutoff is usually the final step in a long, private grieving process. For people who cut ties without warning, the relationship is often emotionally over long before it is externally ended. One of the most important psychological traits here is internal processing. These individuals rarely think out loud when something hurts them. They do not vent easily. They do not escalate conflict early. Instead, they turn inward, they reflect, they rationalize. They empathize with the other person's perspective. They look for context, they excuse behavior. They try to understand rather than react. This inward processing creates the illusion that everything is fine. But internally, a quiet ledger is forming. Each disappointment is noted. Each boundary crossed is remembered. Each time their needs are dismissed or minimized, it registers. They may not speak up, not because they don't feel the pain, but because they are still deciding whether the relationship is salvageable. Silence for them is not indifference, it is evaluation. Another critical psychological layer is emotional loyalty. People who door slam do not leave lightly because they are deeply loyal once attached. Loyalty to them is not performative, it is lived. They show it by staying, by trying, by adapting, by giving the benefit of the doubt long after others would have walked away. This loyalty is often misunderstood as tolerance. It is actually hope. They hope the other person will notice, grow, adjust, care. They hope that if they are patient enough, things will change. And because they don't want to control or demand, they wait for change to come voluntarily. But waiting has a cost. Another important psychological factor is boundary fatigue. People who cut ties without warning are often very aware of boundaries, but they struggle to enforce them early. Not because they don't value boundaries, but because they value harmony, understanding, and connection more. So instead of confronting, they absorb. Instead of demanding, they adapt. Instead of leaving, they endure. Over time, endurance turns into exhaustion. Another layer is emotional asymmetry. Many of these individuals give more emotional labor than they receive. They listen deeply, they understand nuance, they anticipate needs. They adjust their behavior to maintain emotional equilibrium. When this effort is not reciprocated, something subtle shifts. They start feeling unseen, unmet, unimportant, but they don't express this immediately. They don't want to sound needy. They don't want to create conflict. They don't want to be misunderstood, so they carry it quietly. Another psychological truth is that people who door slam often communicate indirectly long before they leave. Their energy changes, they withdraw slightly. They stop initiating, they respond less, they become less available. These are not punishments, they are signals. But because the signals are subtle, they are often missed. By the time the final cutoff happens, the person has already tried to detach emotionally in smaller ways. The door slam is not the first boundary, it is the last. Another key factor is the role of trust erosion. Trust for these individuals is not broken by one event. It erodes slowly, through inconsistency, through feeling misunderstood repeatedly, through having vulnerabilities mishandled, through promises not followed by action. Each instance alone may seem small, together, they become decisive. Once trust drops below a certain threshold, something irreversible happens internally. The emotional bond collapses. And when it collapses completely. This is why the cutoff feels so final. Another psychological layer is that people who cut ties without warning often experience deep guilt about leaving. They are not cold, they are not unfeeling. In fact, they often feel too much. They replay the relationship in their mind. They question themselves. They wonder if they're being unfair. But guilt does not bring connection back once emotional safety is gone. Another important factor is self-protection. For these individuals, staying after emotional clarity arrives feels like self-betrayal. Once they recognize that a relationship is harming their sense of self, staying becomes intolerable. They may have tolerated pain for years, but they will not tolerate self-erasure. Another psychological truth is that confrontation does not feel productive to them at this stage. By the time they are ready to leave, they believe often correctly that explaining would not change anything. They have already explained in other ways. They have already tried, so they choose silence, not to punish, but to preserve themselves. Another layer is the difference between expression and decision. Many people talk their way through decisions. Door slammers decide privately. By the time they act, the decision is complete. This makes the action look abrupt, but the decision was long finished. Another misunderstood aspect is that people who cut ties without warning are often highly empathetic. They understand the impact of their absence. They know it will hurt. They don't take that lightly. But they also know that staying will hurt them more. They choose the pain they can survive. Another psychological dimension is that these individuals often grew up in environments where expressing needs was ineffective or unsafe. They learned early that it was easier to adapt than to ask, easier to endure than to confront. That pattern follows them into adult relationships. The door slam becomes the first time they choose themselves fully. Another important truth is that once they leave, they rarely return. Not because they don't miss the person, but because reopening the door would mean reopening wounds they worked very hard to close. The finality is not spite, it is closure. If you recognize yourself in this pattern, it's important to understand that cutting ties without warning is not a sign that you are heartless. It is often a sign that you reach your limit quietly, patiently, and thoroughly. Another crucial psychological layer behind cutting ties without warning is the long internal dialogue that happens before the external silence. People who door slam are constantly asking themselves questions most people never see. Am I being too sensitive? Did I communicate clearly enough? What if they didn't mean it that way? What if I'm expecting too much? These questions repeat for months, sometimes years. Every time something hurts, the pain is filtered through empathy before it is allowed to become anger. This self-questioning delays action, but it also deepens exhaustion. By the time the final decision is made, the person has already argued against leaving dozens of times internally. Leaving is not the first option, it is the last remaining one. Another important psychological factor is the fear of being misunderstood. Many people who cut ties without warning believe, often based on experience, that explaining themselves will only lead to minimization, defensiveness, or reversal of blame. They anticipate responses like, "You're overreacting," "That's not what I meant," or "Why didn't you say something earlier?" So they don't. Not because they lack words, but because they no longer believe words will be received. Another layer is emotional finality. When these individuals decide to leave, they do so with a sense of completion. They have already mourned the relationship internally. They have imagined life without it. They have felt the grief in advance. What remains is not sadness, but resolve. This is why they often appear calm after cutting ties. The storm already passed. Another psychological truth is that door slammers often hold on longer than they should because they see potential rather than reality. They see who the person could be, not who they consistently are. They hold space for growth that may never come. Letting go means letting go of that imagined future that is a real loss. Another layer is the internal shift from hope to acceptance. Hope keeps them invested, acceptance sets them free. The moment hope dies quietly inside them, the relationship's fate is sealed even if nothing changes outwardly. Once acceptance arrives, action follows swiftly. Another important factor is self-respect consolidation. People who cut ties without warning often reach a moment where their self-respect becomes louder than their attachment. They realize that staying requires shrinking, excusing, or abandoning parts of themselves. They don't leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they started caring about themselves. Another psychological dimension is energy conservation. Explaining, negotiating, confronting all of that requires energy. By the time the door slam happens, energy is gone. Silence becomes the most economical option. They are not withholding explanation. They are depleted of capacity. Another layer is that these individuals often gave warnings in their own language through withdrawal, reduced availability, emotional distance. But because their language is subtle, others miss it. When they finally leave, people say, "This came out of nowhere." It didn't. It came from quiet signals that went unnoticed. Another psychological truth is that door slammers often experience relief mixed with grief. Relief because the emotional strain is gone. Grief because something meaningful ended without closure. Both can coexist. Relief does not mean lack of love. It means release from harm. Another important factor is that once they cut ties, they often enforce strict boundaries, no contact, no checking, no explanations. This is not cruelty, it is containment. Reopening communication would reopen emotional labor they can no longer afford. Distance is how healing begins. Another layer is that door slammers are often highly introspective. After leaving, they reflect deeply on the pattern. They may blame themselves. They may vow to speak up earlier next time. They may question whether the door slam was fair. This reflection is part of growth, not regret. Another psychological truth is that cutting ties without warning is sometimes the only boundary a person knows how to set, especially for those who were never allowed to set small boundaries safely. When small boundaries fail repeatedly, the system jumps to large ones. The door slam is not ideal, it is adaptive. Another layer is the impact on the person who is cut off. From their perspective, the silence feels sudden and harsh. Confusion sets in, anger, hurt. They replay conversations looking for clues. This pain is real, but so was the pain that preceded the silence. Understanding this does not erase hurt, but it contextualizes it. Another psychological dimension is that people who door slam often learn, later in life, to communicate boundaries earlier. Many don't want to repeat the pattern. They realize that silence protected them, but caused connection. Growth involves learning to speak before the breaking point. The door slam is often a phase, not a permanent trait. Another important truth is that this pattern exists on a spectrum. Sometimes it is healthy self-protection. Sometimes it becomes avoidance if repeated without reflection. The difference lies in awareness. Are you leaving because you were unheard? Or because vulnerability feels unsafe? This question matters. Another layer is compassion for self and others. Many door slammers eventually realize they did the best they could with the tools they had. That they stayed longer than most. That leaving was not failure, but preservation. Self-compassion replaces shame. Another psychological truth is that cutting ties without warning often marks the end of people-pleasing. It is a breaking point where the cost of being accommodating exceeds the cost of being misunderstood. That shift is irreversible. Another layer is the quiet empowerment that follows. Once someone realizes they can survive leaving, their fear of abandonment decreases. They become less tolerant of disrespect, more honest, more selective. The door slam, while painful, recalibrates self-worth. Understanding the psychology of people who cut ties without warning reframes the behavior from cruelty to culmination. It shows that the silence is not absence of care, but the end of endurance. That the cutoff is not impulsive, but deliberate. That what looks like disappearance is often the final boundary of someone who tried everything else first. You did not leave because you were cold. You left because you were empty. You did not vanish because you didn't care. You vanished because caring cost too much. And while the door slam may look like an ending, for the person who walked away, it is often the beginning of a life where their inner voice finally matters as much as everyone else's.